philosophy, especially at the turn of the century, of the last century, realizes that something's messed up, and that they have to start thinking about what's messed up. So you have in someone like Edmund Husserl, the father of phenomenology, you have the idea that there's a crisis in European sciences, which is a way of him trying to engage with what's messed up. Science got to a point where um, it's been so completely alienated from human life, and that has constituted a crisis. If you think about the word crisis, crisis just means split. Um, and you have other people like Max Scheler, who is one of the more prominent German philosophers at the time. We don't really know much about him now, unfortunately, but he was going to be one of the people who was going to found the Frankfurt School, and he ended up dying right before. He was living in Nazi Germany at the time, and he was one of the first people that was a strong anti-fascist from the realm of philosophy. And he said that what's messed up is that we have a culture that's dominated by ressentiment. So he brings in this category from Nietzsche. He reinterprets it, though, whereas Nietzsche blames Christianity and slave morality. He ends up saying that no, it was actually the eclecticism that infiltrated Christianity, which led to ressentiment. And he's got some interesting ideas that I think in some areas are correct. But the point is that you have this in the U.S. You have someone like Thorstein Veblen that begins to criticize within somewhat close to a Marxist fashion the culture of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure. And his book ends up getting quite popular. So you start to see a bunch of different philosophical ways of theorizing something that is very clear to everyone, which is that there's something that's messed up. People are at their core prioritizing things and things over human beings, and it's this valuative inversion, this uh, um, uh, transvaluation of values, where the thing and material, tangible objects are put valuatively on top of human beings. And I think that was already clearly formulated in the young Marx in 1844. That's the basis of one of the ways that he's thinking about alienation. There's a variety of ways, but one of the effects is that things are valued much more than humans. There's a quote that the rate at which the valuation of things goes up is proportional to the rate at which human value goes down. Uh, this is 1844. I mean, fucking 6 decades before any of the best theorists of the turn of 6, 7 decades before any of the best theorists of the turn of the century begin to theorize problems that Marx was already describing, I think, a whole lot more correctly, almost a century before.
That's interesting. I've never heard that as the valuation of things goes up, people go down. But that's basically the argument I'm making in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, and using the opioid crisis basically as the evidence of that. Like, they knew it was going to get people addicted. They knew it was going to kill people, and yet they lied about it. They marketed opioids, not just to people, but to physicians, so that they could massively increase prescriptions for pain and anxiety, opioid prescriptions. They knew the effects that it was going to have, and they did it anyway, and they lied about it. Not only did they lie about it, but they created this idea that physicians expressing skepticism about this, physicians who were resistant to prescribing these opioids, were opiophobic. I swear to God, this is in the academic literature. So, you see the complete valuation of, or putting of surplus value and profit and material things over human life in the most disgusting way, to the point where you have these conglomerates, these shareholders on Wall Street, who are supposed to be running the healthcare system, who are supposed to be running the system that brings people healthcare and saves their lives. And instead they're killing 60,000 of them to make billions of dollars. I mean, doing the research on it was truly one of the most disgusting. I mean, it shows you how disgusting these people are. And
no one has been held accountable.
What?
No one has been held accountable to this day for it.
Right. I mean, there's been like like they'll sue Purdue Pharma, and they sued a lot of the main companies behind it, but like all the shareholders just restructure, right? Like maybe the company will go under, but who's the big family, the biggest opioid family? Uh, they're still one of the richest families in the world, the Sackler family, who were the owners of Purdue Pharma. Yeah, like Purdue Pharma's getting sued and stuff, but that's, they're going to be charged $1 billion, have to pay $1 billion in court, and they still have $6 billion, which is something that I write about in the journal, which will be coming out real soon. But absolutely no accountability for just straight murdering 60,000 working class Americans for profit. So
A year.
there's no compromising with the bourgeoisie. There's no compromising with Wall Street.
The article that I was asked to write for this Cuban journal, which I was just told that it's going to be featured as a chapter in a book that's printed by a Cuban editorial. I write about this, and I cite your piece from the journal. But it's incredible how the government was so involved to the point that when there were petitions to release the data, the government and the part of the government, the State Department that had collected the data, was like trying to prevent its release. I'm trying to see if I find the part where I talk about that in my paper, but it's just absolutely bonkers. And I mean, none of these people have been held accountable. You're not held accountable when you make 7 billion or something off of selling a drug that has killed 70,000 Americans a year, and then you have to pay $1 billion in fines. Like, that's not being held fucking accountable. Like, lock these people up, do more. I mean, they spent $40 million giving 68,000 physicians across the U.S. The drug. So, like, they basically bribed the physicians in order to have them prescribe the drugs. Many under the awareness that it wasn't addictive. Many under the awareness that it probably was, but they just chose to ignore it.
Right. A lot of physicians just didn't know. They just take the information they get from NGOs, the academy, and the hospital systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty insane. But it's the epitome of how far the government, which functions as a committee for the bourgeoisie, is willing to go in order to secure the profits of big business. And
part of it happens because of the revolving door, like especially with the academy. People wonder, how could the academy be complicit in the opioid crisis? Well, so there's this revolving door between hospital systems, between healthcare NGOs, between government health institutions, and then corporations and hospital systems. And they make it like that on purpose. So, all the young future healthcare administrators in my classes are being taught how to maintain the profits of corporations. It's not, they're honest about the problems of the system, but their solutions are, how do we continue to make profits? So you have, the academy was pushing this idea of the need to prescribe opioids for pain and addiction. And of course, there was research within the academy that said, this is going to be terrible, but they purposefully suppressed that. And, when most the academics in the field are former USAID employees, like, who's really going to bring it up and make a big stink about it? And if you do, they're going to call you opioid-phobic. And guess what? Pfizer and the Sackler family and all these companies are huge donors to CNN and every media outlet you've ever heard of. So they're going to blast it over the media, the means of communication, that you're opioid-phobic and that you're evil, if you're a physician who doesn't want to get people addicted to fentanyl. And it might sound like I'm getting heated about this, and that's because I am. I hate these bastards, the Sackler family.
Well, you're absolutely right. And then maybe it's just that a lot of people on the left don't know this, but the more I've researched this, the more absurd it seemed like 2 years ago when communist groups were like calling people in the Midwest and just workers in the Midwest who were very skeptical of the vaccine, calling them anti-science or just saying mean things about them because they were skeptical of taking a vaccine that was produced by the same pharmaceutical industrial complex that has given us an opioid crisis that's killing 70,000 Americans a year, in order for them to continue making billions of dollars and cipher them into the politicians and to the media that continues to either ignore or say that there's nothing wrong. So it's, how can you expect people in these regions who have had, everyone knows someone who's been addicted to opioids. How can you expect these people to have trust in medicine after this? How can you expect that? It's a point that I bring up, that I was just asked to do an article for Science for the People on Cuban healthcare and how the blockade affects Cuban healthcare. But you don't have that sort of distrust in medicine in Cuba, because the point of medicine is to cure people. And beyond that, to be so preventative that the stage of curing people doesn't even get there, because you've prevented the health disease from even occurring. It treats medicine, as I've written, as almost like the goal of medicine is almost self-abolition, is to destroy the conditions which lead to medicine being necessary in the first place. And Che was writing about this not writing, but speaking about this in the 1960s in various lectures. It's the opposite of that in the US. Why the hell would you want, when you have a for-profit medical system, for a cure to arise, or for something to be solved, or to have preventative healthcare? That's just the prevention of more profit being realized at a latter point. And so if we don't take that into account, what sort of people are we when we condemn people who are skeptical because they've had family members affected by an opioid crisis that was manufactured by big pharma, by the government, that the academy and the media played a big role in legitimizing and then covering it up? How are we going to blame people for being skeptical? We can't. When we look at all the facts, we can't blame them.
Yeah, and after studying healthcare administration all these years, I would go as far as to say you should be skeptical. If you look at the research, vaccines have been proven to, slow the spread of COVID. I would argue that, there's legitimate research that the vaccines are good. Now, the corporations did everything they could to profit off it and enforce a vaccine apartheid on the global south, and prevent countries from importing or even manufacturing themselves the vaccine using intellectual property laws. And the only reason they wanted a mandate was to make as much money as possible. So, there are a lot of things to be skeptical of, and you got to, look into each case on its own. But you should be skeptical. You should, research what the healthcare system is telling you before you put something in your body. Because they've lied to us time and time again. And since the beginning, like in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, that I'm giving a bunch of spoilers for right now, but that's the research I've been doing. I also try and give a historically materialist analysis of the development of the pharmaceutical industry. So it emerges at the same time capitalism emerges, these for-profit pharmaceutical conglomerates that stem from chemical companies or fertilizer petrochemical companies. And they really they really start to take off during World War II, when there's a need for penicillin and some other antibiotics for the troops. But then after World War II ends, they need to keep their profits high, and that's what's considered the golden age of pharmaceuticals. And there is a lot of technological development. There's a lot of new medicines that are invented at that time. But what they start investing most of their money in is marketing. It's the golden age of pharmaceuticals because they finish with the war. The war helps establish these companies, and then they turn to the American public. They're like, all right, how can we keep our profits high? And, in the process of doing that, they've invented a lot of good life-saving medicine, for sure. But there's also been things like the opioid crisis. They've also lied to us about medicine. They also used intellectual property laws to stop cheaper generic medicines from being made, to prevent and even regress technological and medical progress. And the hospital systems are oftentimes, conglomerated now with insurance companies, with pharmaceutical companies. So it's all just a bunch of shareholders at the top, basically controlling the entire thing. So, be skeptical of them.
It's insane that communists were able, when this whole Uyghur thing came up, and I guess it's still around, this whole bullshit Uyghur genocide accusations that are they have no ground. It was
Kind
wonderful.
of funny how they're going away, though.
Right,
like
right.
The State Department is just giving up on it. Oh, maybe the genocide's not happening. But.
Okay, yeah. It was first genocide, then cultural genocide, and then, maybe there's no evidence for this. But it's crazy how we could say, look at what they've done all over the Middle East. Now tell me if they really give a shit about Muslim minorities. And then people could be like, "Oh, well, yeah, that's true. What's the ulterior motive here? Let me investigate that." And is that driving the propaganda that I'm seeing on TV? Why can't the same be done with healthcare? Look at these other things that they've done. Why would you think that it's irrational for people who have been personally affected by these other things in healthcare to have a lack of trust in a society that says that they wanted to promote X, Y, or Z treatment in order to uh, meet the public good, but who in reality has let a million fucking people die from COVID? Like, what public good are you serving? And why is it irrational for people who know that these are not the people who do anything for public good? They do everything for a buck. And if public good comes about it, it's a latent effect. It's, oh, wow, great. It happened, but that's not really the thing we're trying to do. I don't think it's irrational for people to have that skepticism. And that's something that it doesn't even make sense in Cuba. Like in Cuba, it wouldn't make sense doubting the intentions of medicine because it's so clearly to help people. But here, it's very sad. But the more you look into it, the more you study, you're like, what the hell? I published an article earlier this year for Science for the People on serotonin, and it was the same thing. So much fucking money went into promoting the idea that depression is a result of chemical imbalances in the brain, for which we magically have this beautiful pill for that the more advertisement we put out, the more things it helps with. It's a almost $25 billion industry. It's a massive industry. And, you know, you see it in one field and then you see it with the opioids. And the more you study, the more you're probably going to see it. It's not irrational to doubt, and it's not anti-science. I would say it's in the spirit of science to question science that's led by the profit incentive.
And the articles, like I had chronic illness as a kid and Lyme disease, and I could tell even as a kid going from doctor to doctor. I don't talk about this a lot, but going from doctor to doctor, I could tell there were different opinions between all the doctors on Lyme disease. All right, unfortunately, our stream died here for a second, and I go on to talk about Lyme disease later on, and you'll see that now. I just wanted to add a few things for context, rewatching it. I got Lyme disease when I was 5. I got bit by a deer tick while camping. I had the bullseye rash, which is traditional. Got treated for it. It seemed to work, and then like within a year or within a few months, I started experiencing symptoms that are related to what's called chronic Lyme. This condition that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, or that I talked about in the stream, that affects more and more people every year. And it affects people who haven't had Lyme disease, who haven't been bit by the deer tick and got the bullseye rash. But the vast majority of people who experience chronic Lyme symptoms are people who have gotten bit by the deer tick, been treated for Lyme disease, had their symptoms go away usually, and then have these reoccurring chronic symptoms. So there's tons of debate. It's a hot button issue within medicine. As to how to deal with it, there are doctors who are super arrogant about it and say that basically patients are faking it. All their symptoms are subjective or in their heads. And in my experience, what would work for me were changing my diet, going to therapy, even doing some more out there things like hypnosis, acupuncture, things like this that, where a doctor was telling me to change something in my lifestyle or, trying to figure out what was going on in my brain in terms of anxiety and things like that. Those were the things that helped. But none of those things were covered by insurance ever. The insurance would only cover medical doctors, physicians in hospitals or clinics, and pharmaceuticals, whatever they would prescribe you. And the thing with chronic Lyme is, pharmaceuticals, antibiotics have pretty much shown to be ineffective. What helps people is more, quote unquote, alternative medicine or Eastern medicine. So there's a lot of doctors and a lot of people who, are hardcore in favor of Western medicine, or the corporations and conglomerates who dominate Western medicine, who will say, this isn't even a real condition. If you can't treat it with antibiotics and pharmaceuticals, it can't be real, right? So yeah, that's what I'll go on to talk a little bit about here, but I just wanted to add this little blurb because I feel like it's useful to adding context to the whole Lyme disease thing.
Someone mentioned here, Cuba has a lung cancer vaccine. Yes, they have a lung cancer vaccine. They also have other vaccines that are, studies have been shown that they're really, really good for treating various forms of cancer. They also have a diabetes treatment that cuts down the potential for amputation by half. And when you look at what ends up happening after people end up needing an amputation, I think like 60% of them die within 5 years, and 80% of them die within 80 years. So the reason why we don't have both the lung cancer vaccine and the other cancer vaccines and the diabetes treatment is because of the blockade. So it's not just the case that the blockade is affecting Cuban medicine, which of course it is. It prevents them from getting tools and medicines and a variety of different things that are necessary for the healthcare system. It also affects Americans because there's approximately like at 60, with the case of diabetes, there's 60,000 Americans who would be prevented an amputation statistically if they had that Cuban treatment, and who will not be getting that potential prevented amputation and therefore dying within 5 to 10 years because they don't have that. So when you take into account lung cancer and the other vaccines, there's somewhere near to 100,000 Americans that die a year because they don't have medicine, or that are potentially going to die in the near future because they don't have medicine that has been developed in Cuba because of the blockade.
Hmm. All I was saying earlier before I got cut off there, before my Wi-Fi died, was I had to do a literature review summarizing all the academic peer-reviewed literature on the condition that I was diagnosed with, and I learned a lot from that, and, learned a lot about where my doctors were coming from. And, the more I read, the more I disagreed with a lot of the physicians and their way of going about it. But you can do like all that medical literature is there if you want to do the research yourself, if you're motivated, like if you get prescribed something and you're skeptical about it, or diagnosed with something, like you can do a lot of research yourself. I know someone said the average doctor knows more than the average person. Like, listen to your doctor. I mean, that's such a simplistic way to look at it. I mean, yeah, the average doctor knows more. You should take your doctor's advice, into account, but you can still do your own research, right? You can still be skeptical. You can still ask questions, and understand that, you may not know as much as your doctor, but also your doctor may be influenced by by corporations. They may be influenced by NGOs. The physicians may just not be questioning what they're doing because they don't want to get attacked as being opioid-phobic, and all of a sudden be at the center of all this controversy and potentially losing their job, which is what we know the pharmaceutical corporations were doing on purpose now, smearing people as opioid-phobic. A lot of these doctors just want to do their job, so they're just gonna kind of do what they're told. So
Pedamito wants to know if you could continue with the Lyme disease story. So
that
after you're
was,
done.
I mean, that's what I was saying. I mean, I had to do a literature review on Lyme, and like, I don't know. There's not a lot we know um, about chronic Lyme, and there's a lot of doctors who think it's like essentially not real. They'll basically say that like all the symptoms are subjective, but there's been a growing number of people with Lyme. A huge percentage of them, like 90% of them, are people who got Lyme disease and tested positive for it, like got bit by a tick, got traditional Lyme disease, had it treated with medication. Maybe I'll post my literature review on Midwestern Marks. Maybe we should publish it because it's not explicitly Marxist, but it is probably worth reading. But and the number of people with Lyme is growing. It's concentrated within certain populations within especially the Midwest and anywhere where there's the deer tick, which is known to carry Lyme. But there's a distinction between Lyme disease and chronic Lyme. And a lot of doctors are saying the 500,000 people, the growing number of people whose conditions are chronic, I mean, whose symptoms are chronic or whose symptoms go away after being treated, but then come back, they basically say those people are faking it because there's no real treatment with medicine, right? The treatment that works for people with chronic Lyme is like therapy, nutrition, exercise, putting yourself in a better environment. That doesn't make them any money. So they're basically like, oh, well, it's not real. I mean, that's my interpretation after doing the literature review and having the condition and going to a million different doctors. But they can't sell you a pill for it. They don't care. And, I made that argument even to one of my like pro USAID liberal professors. Like, they're saying that people are faking it because they can't make any money off it. And she was like, you right. So
I found the quote that I mentioned earlier. I don't know if you want me to read it. We had such a long intro in the middle. So this is from the manuscripts of 84. With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men. Today, the PC language, we would say the world of people, or the human world. I mean, we come to value things more and more and more, and people less and less and less.
For sure. I like that. You might have to send me that quote.